picture this. It is the 4th of July 1187, and the air on a scorched hilltop in Galilee still tastes of smoke and iron. The battle is over. Thousands of the finest knights in Christendom are lying dead, dying, or roped together in the dust like cattle, and inside a great pavilion at the summit, a middle-aged man with a short greying beard is calmly offering a cup of iced rosewater to his prisoner, the captured king of Jerusalem. The king, half dead with thirst, drinks and then passes the cup along to the man kneeling beside him. And the man in the pavilion, the one everyone in your history books calls gentle, tolerant, chivalrous, the noble Sultan, quietly says through his interpreter that it was the king who gave that man the water, not him. It is a small sentence. It is also a death sentence. Because by the unbreakable law of the desert, if you give a captive food or drink, his life is protected. And Saladin has just made absolutely sure that this particular prisoner received nothing from his hand. Moments later, that prisoner is dead, and the man who killed him, or gave the final order for it, is the same man Hollywood turned into the perfect enemy. Honestly, we usually picture Saladin as the one good guy on the other side, the merciful knight in a war full of monsters, the tolerant genius who outclassed the barbaric Crusaders. But the reality documented by his own closest companion, the judge and biographer Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, who was physically there for much of this, is far colder and far more calculating than the legend. So how does a Kurdish outsider, with no royal blood, no birthright, and no army of his own become the most feared man of his age, the Sultan who terrified all of Christendom and then get remembered by his enemies as a saint? And why was that gentle legend in the end one of the most useful lies ever told? Before we ride back to the beginning of this story of survival and cold ambition, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truth buried underneath the legends, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe here to Warfront. And do me a favour, drop a comment telling me which corner of the world you're watching from right now, because I find it genuinely incredible that we get to sit here, centuries later, and pull these ancient men apart together, connected across time by nothing but our shared hunger for what really happened. So let's go back, not to a throne, but to a caravan fleeing in the night. The man the world would come to call Salah ad-Din, the righteousness of the faith, was born around the year 1137 in the fortress town of Tikrit, on the Tigris, in what is now Iraq. And here is the first thing the legend quietly erases. Saladin was not an Arab. He was a Kurd, an ethnic outsider in a world of Turkish warlords and Arab caliphs. His family, the sons of Ayyub, were not princes, they were hired muscle. Professional soldiers who served more powerful men for pay and for cities to govern. And the very night Saladin was supposedly born, his father Ayyub and his uncle Shirkuh were being expelled from Tikrit in disgrace, packing up their household in the dark and riding out into an uncertain future. Put yourself in that saddle for a second. You're a stateless mercenary family, riding away from the one town you controlled, with a newborn baby and no guarantee anyone will ever hire you again. They got hired, and to understand how big a deal that was, you have to understand the world they were riding into. The Middle East of the 12th century was not one empire. It was a shattered chessboard. In the east, the Turkish warlords who nominally answered to the caliph in Baghdad. In the west, in Egypt, a rival Shia caliphate, the Fatimids, sitting on the single richest economy in the Mediterranean world. And wedged along the coast in between, the Crusader states, a chain of European kingdoms carved out of Muslim land less than 40 years earlier, when the First Crusade took Jerusalem in 1099 and, let us be honest about it, butchered its inhabitants in the streets until the chroniclers claimed men were wading in blood. That massacre is the ghost hovering over this entire story. Remember it. It matters enormously later. Into that chaos rose the man who would make Saladin. His name was Nur ad-Din, a Turkish ruler of Aleppo and then Damascus, and he was the most powerful Muslim leader of his generation. He was also something new, a prince who wrapped himself in piety and preached jihad, holy war, as a tool to unite the fractured Muslims against the Crusader occupiers. Saladin's uncle Shirkuh became one of Nur ad-Din's top generals, and young Saladin grew up in Nur ad-Din's Damascus in the shadow of that court. Here is a detail the action movie version skips. As a young man, Saladin does not seem to have wanted any of this. By the accounts that survive, he was more drawn to religious study and quiet administration than to the battlefield. He was the reluctant one, he was comfortable. And comfort, as you are about to see, was a luxury the game would not let him keep. Because the game was about Egypt. Egypt was the ultimate prize, the richest state on the board, and its Fatimid caliphate was rotting from the inside, run by boy caliphs and murderous viziers stabbing each other in palace corridors. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled the wealth to win everything else. Let us look at the raw numbers for a second. Egypt's tax revenue and trade dwarfed anything the Crusader kingdoms or the Syrian cities could produce. Seizing it was like seizing the single most valuable corporation on earth, one that printed money every single year from the Nile and the Red Sea trade. And both sides wanted it. Nur ad-Din wanted it, and so did the Crusader king of Jerusalem, Amalric, who kept invading Egypt to bleed it dry. So Nur ad-Din sent his best general, Shirkuh, to get there first. And Shirkuh dragged his reluctant, comfortable young nephew along. Saladin, by his own later admission, did not want to go. He was pulled into Egypt against his will on the third of these brutal expeditions in 1168 and 1169. And it was there, in a city under siege, that a single roll of the dice changed the shape of the world. His uncle Shirkuh outmaneuvered the Crusaders, marched into Cairo, and got himself appointed vizier, the true power behind the puppet Fatimid caliph. And then, just months later, Shirkuh gorged himself at a banquet, choked, and died. Suddenly there was a vacancy at the very top of the richest state in the world, and the Fatimid caliph, a Shia teenager looking at a room full of ambitious Sunni generals, made what he thought was the safe choice. He picked the youngest, the least threatening, the one everyone assumed they could control. He picked Saladin. Honestly, think about how insane that gamble was from every angle. The caliph thought he was appointing a pushover. Nur ad-Din, back in Syria, thought he was appointing a loyal servant who would run Egypt on his behalf. Everybody looked at this quiet 31-year-old Kurd and saw a man they could use. Put yourself in his boots for a second. You have just been handed the keys to the wealthiest kingdom on the planet, and every single powerful person around you believes you are their tool. You have your own family pushing you to seize real power, and two overlords above you who will crush you the instant you look too independent. What do? Do you stay small and safe? Or do you start playing a game where the losing move is death? Saladin chose to play, and the man everyone underestimated turned out to be the coldest strategist on the board. First, he secured his base. He quietly filled Egypt's key positions with his own kinsmen, the sons of Ayyub, turning a foreign posting into a family stronghold. Then he made his move against the caliph who had appointed him. In 1171, Saladin simply abolished the Fatimid caliphate. He had the Friday prayers said in the name of the Sunni caliph in Baghdad instead, erasing 2 centuries of the Fatimid dynasty with a decree. The Shia caliph was conveniently dying at the time, and when he was gone, Saladin did not appoint a successor. He just took it all. In one calculated stroke, he had made himself the master of Egypt in fact, not just in name. He was no longer anyone's tool, and that immediately made him a target. Because now Nur ad-Din, his own overlord, was watching a servant become a rival. And this is the part the noble Saladin legend really does not want you to sit with. For the next years, the great champion of holy war spent far more of his energy manoeuvring against fellow Muslims than fighting Crusaders. When Nur ad-Din demanded money and obedience from Egypt, Saladin stalled, sent excuses, dragged his feet. Twice. When Nur ad-Din campaigned against the Crusaders and expected Saladin to link up with him, Saladin found reasons to withdraw his army early, because the last thing he wanted was to be caught in the field, alone, next to the one man strong enough to destroy him. The chronicler Ibn al-Athir, no great fan of Saladin, records the growing fury between the two. A war between them was coming. It was inevitable. And then, in 1174, fate did for Saladin what he might not have dared do himself. Nur ad-Din suddenly fell ill and died. His heir was a boy of about 11. And here is where you see the machine of Saladin's mind working in real time. Officially, publicly, he wept for his old master and declared himself the loyal protector of the boy. In practice, he moved with breathtaking speed to swallow the inheritance whole. He rode north out of Egypt with a small force and took Damascus, claiming he was only there to guard the child heir's interests. Then he took Homs, then Hama. Piece by piece, city by city, always in the name of unity, always in the name of jihad against the Crusaders, he devoured the lands of the very dynasty that had raised him. The boy heir's supporters called him exactly what he was, a usurper, a servant stealing his master's kingdom, and they fought back, hard. For roughly a decade, this is the real Saladin story, and it is a story most documentaries skip entirely. It is not a clean crusade of Muslim against Christian. It is a grinding civil war of Muslim against Muslim. Saladin besieged Aleppo, the great Zengid stronghold, more than once. He fought the Boyars regents. He fought the powerful ruler of Mosul. He fought coalitions of his own co-religionists who saw him correctly as an ambitious outsider grabbing everything. And it nearly got him killed. Not once, but twice the assassins, the feared Nizari sect operating from their mountain fortresses, sent killers into his own camp with knives. One attack got close enough that a blade grazed him, and only a mail cap under his turban and armour beneath his robes saved his life. After that, Saladin reportedly slept in a specially built wooden tower and trusted almost no one. Put yourself in that tower for a second. You are the supposed champion of Islam, and the people most desperate to murder you are other Muslims. So why the relentless drumbeat of jihad? Why did Saladin, in every letter and every proclamation, wrap himself in the flag of holy war against the Crusaders even while he was mostly fighting other Muslims? Because it was the single most powerful tool he had, and he understood it perfectly. Jihad was legitimacy. It was branding. An ethnic Kurd with no royal blood, no legal claim to Egypt or Syria, needed a reason for everyone to accept his rule that was bigger than mere conquest. And there was no bigger reason on offer than this. Be the man who will finally retake Jerusalem. Be the sword of God. Every city he swallowed he could justify by saying he needed it to unify the Muslims for the great holy war to come. His piety was almost certainly sincere, but it was also, at the exact same time, the most brilliant political strategy of the age. The holy war gave him the right to take everything, and to actually launch it, he first had to own everything. By 1186, after 12 years of patience, bribery, siege and cold nerve, he did. Aleppo had fallen to him. Mosul had submitted. For the first time in generations, Egypt and Muslim Syria were united under a single man, and the Crusader states along the coast were now almost completely surrounded. A thin strip of European kingdoms encircled on every landward side by one enormous empire ruled by one patient Kurd. Everything he had built, every betrayal, every broken loyalty, every drop of Muslim blood spilled in those civil wars had been for this. The trap was finally set. All he needed was for the Crusaders to be foolish enough to walk into it, and thanks to one reckless, treaty-breaking baron, they were about to hand him the greatest opportunity of his entire life. That baron was Reynold of Chatillon, and you need to remember his name because he is the man from our very first scene. Reynold was, by any measure, a violent adventurer. While Saladin and the Crusader leadership held to fragile truces, Reynold raided the rich Muslim caravans that were the lifeblood of trade, robbing pilgrims and merchants regardless of any treaty. And then he did the single most inflammatory thing any Crusader ever did. He launched a fleet of ships into the Red Sea and sent raiders toward the holy cities of Mecca and Medina themselves, the beating heart of Islam. To Saladin, this was not just a border raid. It was a direct assault on the faith he claimed to protect, and a personal humiliation he swore he would answer with Reynold's own blood. Honestly, if you were Saladin, this was almost a gift. Reynold had just handed the champion of jihad the perfect villain, the perfect provocation, the perfect excuse to unleash the war he had spent his whole life preparing for. And the Crusader kingdom, at that exact moment, was tearing itself apart. Their new king, Guy of Lusignan, was weak and disputed, his throne contested, his barons split into factions that hated each other. So in the summer of 1187, when Saladin invaded and laid siege to the town of Tiberias by the Sea of Galilee, the Crusaders faced an impossible choice, and they chose wrong. Some of their wisest commanders, including Raymond of Tripoli, whose own wife was trapped inside besieged Tiberias, begged the king not to march. The land between them and the town was a bone-dry plateau with almost no water in the crushing July heat. To cross it in armour would be suicide. Wait, they said. Let Saladin come to us on ground of our choosing. But Reynold and the hardliners called Raymond a coward and a traitor, and King Guy, weak and desperate to look strong, gave the order that doomed his kingdom. March. So picture it now. Tens of thousands of Crusaders, the largest army the kingdom had ever assembled, stripping the fortresses of their garrisons to do it, marching out across a waterless furnace in full armour under the July sun. Let us look at the raw scale of what they were wearing. A knight's mail hauberk alone weighed as much as a loaded suitcase you have to carry every step, over a padded gambeson that trapped heat like an oven, and a warhorse, and full equipment. cost the modern equivalent of a heavily armoured vehicle, easily past $100,000 in today's money. These were the most expensive, most elite soldiers on Earth, the special forces of the medieval world, and they were cooking alive inside their own gear with every mile. And Saladin, watching from the high ground, did not need to beat them with brilliance. He just needed the sun, the thirst, and patience. He had all three. His horsemen swarmed them the whole way, harassing, stinging, never committing, forcing the exhausted column to keep formation and keep burning through their strength. By the time the Crusaders staggered toward a twin-peaked hill called the Horns of Hattin, they were a dying army that did not yet know it. They could see the Sea of Galilee shimmering in the distance, all that water, and they could not reach it, because Saladin's army stood between them and every drop. That night, the Muslims lit fires in the dry summer scrub, and the wind rolled thick smoke into the Crusader camp, choking men already half mad with thirst. Bahar ad-Din and other chroniclers describe the horror of it. Imagine standing in that camp. Your throat is closed with dust. Your lips are cracked and bleeding. You can smell water you will never taste, and you can hear the enemy chanting in the dark all around you, and you know with total certainty that the sun is going to rise on the worst day of your life. It did. On the 4th of July, 1187, the exhausted, dehydrated Crusader army tried to break out toward the water and shattered against Saladin's fresh, disciplined lines. It was less a battle than a slow execution. Knights charged and were swallowed. The infantry, crazed with thirst, broke and were cut down or captured. And at the centre of it all, the Crusaders' most sacred relic, a fragment they believed to be the true cross of Christ itself, the object they carried into battle as the very presence of God, was taken. When that relic fell, the chroniclers say the heart went out of the whole army. Put yourself in their boots in that final hour. The thing you believed made you invincible, the physical proof that God was on your side, is being carried away by the enemy, and the sky has not opened and no angels have come. Just the heat and the horsemen and the end. The kingdom of Jerusalem lost its entire field army in a single afternoon, which brings us back to the pavilion and the cup of iced water. King Guy and the great barons, including Reynald of Châtillon, were dragged before Saladin as prisoners. And here Saladin performed a piece of theatre so precise it tells you everything about the mind behind the legend. He treated the captured king with pointed courtesy and handed him that cooling drink, the signal that Guy, the king, would live. But when Guy passed the cup to Reynald, Saladin made his cold little statement about who had given the water to whom, freeing himself from any obligation of mercy. Then he turned on Reynald and confronted him with all his broken oaths, all his raids, his assault on the holy cities. And when Reynald answered with defiance, Saladin, according to his own biographer who was present in the aftermath, struck him down with his own hand and his guards finished it. The chivalrous Sultan of legend had just personally executed a helpless prisoner. He then reassured the terrified king that kings do not kill kings, and that Reynald had died for his crimes, not his crown. Every gesture calculated, every message deliberate, mercy and murder delivered in the same breath. And then came the moment the noble Saladin legend truly cannot survive. Among the thousands of prisoners were the captured knights of the Templars and the Hospitallers, the two great military orders. Think of them as the ultimate fanatical special forces of the Crusades, holy warriors sworn never to surrender and never to be ransomed, the single most dangerous fighting men in the Christian world. Saladin knew that as long as they lived, they would always come back. So he made a calculation. He ordered them executed. Not on the battlefield in the heat of combat, but afterward, in cold blood, hundreds of them. And in a detail his own admiring secretary Imad ad-Din records almost with approval. Saladin had them killed not by soldiers, but by the pious scholars and mystics in his own camp, the men of religion, as a kind of holy act. Some of these amateurs botched it horribly. Honestly, sit with that image for a moment. The man remembered by Europe as the gentle, tolerant knight handed hundreds of bound prisoners to clerics to be hacked to death as a religious offering. He spared the common soldiers, yes, because they could be sold. Tens of thousands of them were funneled into the slave markets, so many that the sources say the price of a healthy prisoner collapsed, and a man could be bought for the price of a pair of sandals. Mercy, where it appeared, was almost always also arithmetic. With the Crusader army destroyed and its castles stripped of defenders to feed that doomed march, the coast fell like a row of dominoes. Acre, Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, one after another, most surrendering without much of a fight because there was simply no one left to defend them. And then, in the autumn of 1187, Saladin arrived before the ultimate prize, the entire reason for the flag he had carried his whole life: Jerusalem. The holy city in Muslim hands again after 88 years. Inside, a nobleman named Balian of Ibelin organised a desperate last defence with almost no real soldiers, knighting teenagers and merchants just to man the walls. But it was hopeless, and everyone knew it. And here, at the climax of his entire career, Saladin faced the decision that would define his legend forever. Because hovering over that city was the ghost we talked about at the start, the memory of 1099, when the Crusaders took Jerusalem and drowned it in blood. Saladin's own men wanted that same vengeance, 88 years of it. Take the city by storm, they said, and pay the Christians back in kind for the massacre their grandfathers committed on these same streets. And Saladin, at first, swore he would do exactly that, take it by the sword. But then Balian sent him a message that was pure cold calculation, and Saladin, the master of cold calculation, understood it instantly. Balian warned that if there was no mercy, the defenders would first destroy everything holy in the city, the Muslim shrines included, kill their own families to spare them slavery, and then die fighting to the last man, taking as many of Saladin's soldiers with them as they could. In other words, a storm would cost Saladin a fortune in blood and leave him ruling a graveyard of rubble. So Saladin made a deal. He agreed to a ransom instead. Every person in the city could buy their freedom. 10 dinars for a man, 5 for a woman, 1 for a child. Pay and walk free. Fail to pay and be enslaved. And this is the act that made him a legend in Europe forever. The merciful conqueror who didn't repeat the massacre of 1099. It is genuinely true, and it genuinely mattered that he did not butcher the population the way the Crusaders had. But look closely at what the mercy actually was. It was a business transaction. Thousands who could scrape together the ransom walked out alive, but thousands more who could not, the poor, could not pay, and were marched off into slavery, families torn apart at the gates. Saladin and his brother did free some of them out of genuine generosity, and the sources praise him for it. But the machine still ran on money. The famous mercy of Jerusalem was, at its core, mercy for those who could afford it. It was humane, and it was calculated, and both of those things were true at the same time, which is the truest thing you can say about the entire man. The fall of Jerusalem sent a shockwave through Europe that summoned the most dangerous response of Saladin's life. The Third Crusade, the greatest kings in the Christian world took the cross and came for him, and one of them was a warrior every bit Saladin's equal on the battlefield, the King of England, Richard the Lionheart. For the next years, the patient Sultan, who had never really been beaten, found himself locked against a tactical genius, who beat him in the open field. At the Siege of Acre, the Crusaders clawed the great port back, and there, Richard showed a coldness to match Saladin's own. When negotiations over the surrendered Muslim garrison stalled, Richard had roughly 2,700 of his Muslim prisoners marched out in front of the walls, in full view of Saladin's army, and executed. Then, at the Battle of Arsuf, Richard's disciplined charge broke Saladin's forces and shattered, for the whole watching world, the myth that the Sultan was invincible. Here is the strange human truth of that final chapter, the one the legends actually got partly right. Saladin and Richard, these two ruthless killers who spent years trying to destroy each other, never once met face to face, but they developed something like respect across the lines, negotiating through Saladin's brother, trading envoys and even gifts. When Richard's horse was killed under him, the sources say Saladin sent him fresh mounts, unwilling to see a king reduced to fighting on foot. When Richard fell sick with fever, Saladin reportedly sent him fruit cooled with snow from the mountains. These stories are half history and half theatre, and Saladin, remember, was a master of exactly that kind of theatre. But underneath the gestures was a genuine stalemate. Richard could not retake Jerusalem. Saladin could not drive the Crusaders into the sea. Both men were exhausted, running out of money and men. So in 1192 they signed a truce. The Crusaders kept a thin strip of coast. Christian pilgrims got the right to visit Jerusalem in peace, but Jerusalem itself stayed in Saladin's hands. He had held the prize, and then, having built an empire that stretched from Egypt to the Tigris, having crushed the greatest kings of Europe to a standstill, having done the one thing he swore his whole life to do, Saladin went home to Damascus and within months died. In March of 1193, a fever took him. He was around 56, And here is the detail that his devoted biographer Baha ad-Din records, the one that stops you cold. When the most powerful man in the Islamic world died, master of Egypt and Syria and everything between, there was reportedly not enough money in his personal treasury to pay for his own funeral, not because he had been robbed, but because he had given it all away. He had poured his wealth into his armies, his building projects, and vast charity, and kept almost nothing for himself. The man who conquered kingdoms died owning barely more than a mid-level clerk. Whatever else he was not in it, in the end, for gold. So who was he really? Strip away the Hollywood halo and the Walter Scott novel that turned him into a perfect gentleman knight for European readers 6 centuries after his death. What you are left with is not a saint and not a monster, but something far more interesting than either. A stateless Kurdish outsider who was handed power almost by accident, and then outthought, outweighted, and outmaneuvered every single person who ever underestimated him. A man who spent more years fighting his fellow Muslims than his Christian enemies, and who used the holy flag of jihad as both a sincere faith and a ruthless political weapon, often at the very same time. A commander capable of genuine, documented generosity, and of personally executing a prisoner and handing hundreds more to be slaughtered when the calculation demanded it. The legend of the gentle Saladin was not simply invented, it was earned by real acts of mercy, and then it was inflated by his own brilliant sense of theatre and by an admiring Europe into a mask that hid the cold, patient and utterly formidable strategist underneath. He terrified the Crusaders not because he was cruel, but because he was disciplined, endlessly patient, and always thinking 3 moves ahead while they charged blindly into the sun. So I will leave you with this. Go back to that pavilion on the hilltop on the 4th of July 1187. You are Saladin. In front of you kneel 2 defeated men. One you will spare, one you will kill, and the gesture you use to decide their fates is a single cup of water, handed one way instead of another. You could show pure mercy and let them both live and look like a saint to the whole world. Or you could do what the survival of your entire empire seems to demand, and remove the enemies who will only come back to kill you if you let them breathe. Knowing everything you now know about how this man built his world out of patience and cold arithmetic, would you have offered the second man that cup? Or would you have done exactly what Saladin did? Let me know your honest answer down in the comments. And if you appreciated pulling the real man out from underneath the legend, hit subscribe here at Warfront, because there is another deep dive into the brutal truth of history waiting for you right now on your screen.